Hello, everyone. Professor Barry here. This week we are moving into race stratification, ethnicity, an incredibly important and valuable topic. It's always, developing analytical tools, developing ways of thinking, knowing, developing a greater understanding of history and the power of history to shape, of course, the past, but we bring history forward into the present. I mean, to understand race relations today, my experience has been the more I understand the past, the more I can appreciate understanding some of the challenges around race that we face today. I can understand white privilege in a more fundamental fashion. I can understand and humanize individuals who are refusing or have a difficult time kind of giving up old ways of thinking about race. Because it sort of put people in a context, right? And sort of think about, well, we are all human. We are all basically have the similar central processing unit. So when we see differences in terms of attitudes, behaviors, disposition, it raises the question about where are those social forces coming into play that are shaping individuals, groups, and communities. Okay, so before I go too far down a tangent down that way, I'll kind of bring it back. And the goal of this particular lecture is to provide some good foundations, some good concepts, theories, ideas, and just kind of open up kind of a new perspectives in thinking about race. I'll provide a lot of different examples, different illustrations to hopefully make ideas about race more clear, but also much more recognition that they're much more complex and much more deeply entrenched in society than maybe we think. As you guys do, write up your summaries. Overall, the summaries have been going really well, but I've kind of noticed one pattern I've noticed is there's been a move for some to not discuss as much about specific content in the lecture videos. Bring in content. I mean, part of the assignment is bringing in content from the lecture videos into your summary and your summary points. When you're thinking about main theories, main themes, for example, one of them that we'll talk about, the social construction of race. So with that as an example, define and explain the social construction of race. I think for each point that you get into, you should be asking yourself the question, or you should be thinking about, is there something I need to define? I need to explain something. Let me define, let me explain, let me provide specific information from the lecture into the summary point. And then, you can kind of explore maybe your own kind of like some different thoughts about the content or examples and illustrations, but you got to start out with a grounding in defining and explaining. Okay, so here we go. Let me kind of go to the PowerPoint here. Kind of start off with this slide, that it's hard to mark a time period when we started moving this direction, but biological ideas of race go back to about the 1700s. As a byproduct of the Enlightenment and science. It was a byproduct of colonization, of exploration from Western European countries, other places around the world. So encountering different people, different groups, this global trade system that's developing. So ideas of race got rooted there in the 1700s, 1800s. And then starting in probably 1960s, 1970s, more and more discussion and recognition that those biological ideas of race were faulty, problematic. Started viewing them as biological racism or scientific racism, I mean, that science was reproducing ideas that were reinforcing ideas of racial inequality. And that we moved to this idea that race is a social construct. Race is something that humans give meaning to things. Humans have developed those categories of race. They're not embedded within an individual's biology, their genetics, and who they are. I don't know where I heard this. So somebody was making a comment. I think it was Isabel Wilkerson, who recently has a book called Caste, and looking at race through a caste lens, that the United States is a caste-based system. It's got my book over there. Yeah, basically looking at caste. So really, there's a great podcast with Isabel Wilkerson on caste and using that analogy or that framework to think about America and stratification. So that America is more than a system of, America is more than, a system that's based on racial inequality, going back to slavery, indentured servitude slavery to present. It's a caste-based system that includes a racial component. Anyway, I bring that up because in her book, she mentions that she was given a talk one time and somebody came up to her afterwards. The person's from sub-Saharan Africa. I can't remember what country. Came up to her after the talk and said, you know, there's no Black people in Africa. And Isabel Wilkerson had to pause for a second and thought about it. Said, oh yeah, there are no Black people in Africa. They become Black when they enter and migrate or immigrate to Western European countries, the United States, where we have that category of Black. That language is powerful and important. In any language, these are categories, right? So that's the idea that the categories themselves are human creations. They're not determined by biology, but at the same time, race is powerful because this is the way we believe certain things about race, right? More so in the past when culture was really immersed in biological ideas about race, it gave justification for inequalities, intelligence, criminality, sexual behavior, like a lot of different things were being sort of explained as sort of biologically rooted and determined. And if it's rooted in biology, there's no responsibility to the social, there's no responsibility to the social context and environment in that. Okay, so that's kind of defining it. So let's kind of talk about, so I give you some examples of biological conceptions of race. This is 1854 scientific book on looking at biological races. During that time period, scientists were identifying 4 main categories of race. I mean, just to give you another example of why or how race is a social construct, is that the US Census recognizes 26 plus races today. You look at the history and development of the US Census over a long period of time, you can see that the racial categories have changed over history, and in recent years become much more expansive. That's because of, culture's changing, culture's moving. Biology of the individual actors in a society are not changing, but rather it's the ways we think about race are changing. This is scientific racism. I mean, this is like a great example. Here's a sort of idea that the person descended from Africa, as we all are, right? But the individuals with stereotypically certain features were more akin to the primate world. This is scientific racism. And the evolutionary perspective, you can kind of see it in this particular chart from the 1800s as well, as you have the sort of evolutionary perspective with the kind of the white Greek is a Greek, Roman, statuesque kind of form is at the top of the hierarchy. And the further you go down to get to that primate world. One thing to kind of notice is really interesting, and in class usually I talk about this, won't spend a lot of time here, but look at the difference here. Like you look at the actual characterization here, and then look at the skull over here, and notice the big difference in terms of these are like, okay, that's kind of close, not even close. Like what's going on here? Like why this misrepresentation from the left to the right, even, here to here. Look at the turning of the skull. The skull here is turned closer. Vantage point is not the jaw elongated, but more like this, which gives you a different perspective of that human skull. There's a lot of argument and a lot of discussion in academic literature. Stephen Jay Gould, whose work on looking at the science behind all this kind of stuff, is that his viewpoint is that scientists were reproducing these ideas, not intentionally. They weren't like somebody when they create this diagram, they didn't do that intentionally, but rather this was a reflection of the ways they were thinking about race during that particular time. And I think it's an important point, is that for Stephen Jay Gould and others, what's getting reproduced is oftentimes at the unconscious level. And people hold on to ideas and values and beliefs that are they operate under, but it's unconscious. It's not necessarily always deliberate. So, okay, biological ideas of race led us to a couple different places. Okay, in the United States, we had laws that were prohibiting the mixing of races. Miscegenation is the mixing of races. And we had laws that were prohibiting the mixing of races. The Racial Integrity Act of 1924. I mean, this sort of, you can read that statement from Walter Plecker, who was an advocate and for this particular Racial Integrity Act, drawing a line specifically between whites and blacks, but also among other groups as well. But that was a real powerful link. You can see it. It's interesting how the fear and the concern of whites and blacks interacting with one another, it warrants explanation. I mean, where does that come from? Why that disdain? Why that distinction? And I think you have to go to ideas about biological race and that are advancing certain ideas about racial purity. And then you also have to put into context in terms of the United States and our history of formal slavery and system of after emancipation and after Reconstruction in the South and the establishment of Jim Crow laws to suppress and to keep blacks in a subordinate position, that this kind of separation was deeply entrenched in American culture. We oftentimes think about, okay, so you kind of get this idea about mixing of races sometimes can take you to Hitler and ideas about eugenics, eu meaning good, genetics, genes, good genes. And the idea during the eugenics movement was to create a stronger, more fit society through controlling genetic population, advocating for individuals who are of a higher or better genetic stock to reproduce and to do that's on the eugenic side, help promote good genes. And then also on the negative side, how to decrease the negative genetic pool. Part of that, was involuntary sterilization, extermination of individuals and groups. It takes you to Hitler, it takes you to Nazi Germany. It's important to know that the scientists who were developing these ideas of eugenics were scientists in the United States, as well as in England. And these ideas of eugenics were transmitted, culturally diffused throughout various places around the world. There's a really interesting film called Rabbit Proof Fence about Australia and their experience with eugenics, and the idea that they had in Australia was that in 2 or 3 generations, if they could inbreed whiteness, the English stock, into the Aboriginal people, they could create a stronger race. And this is absurd from contemporary standards, right? It's hard to imagine that that's the place of where people were thinking back in the day. But it was deeply entrenched in the way people thought. It gave justification for, as I mentioned before, for things like criminality and poverty. It all put it into the biology versus looking at issues in terms of the larger social structure. Here's an example of kind of like that social construction of race, the arbitrary nature of it. So Susie Gilroy Phipps, if you look at her genetic stock and sort of look back in terms of her history, she's 1/32 of Black blood, of African descent. Her background or her story is she applied for either a visa or a passport. She was going to go travel somewhere outside the United States. She needed that document. To get that document, she needed to provide her birth certificate. She goes to look at her birth certificate, never seen it before, and on her birth certificate, it said colored on her birth certificate. She didn't realize that. She viewed herself as being white, had no recognition of any other part of her history. So she went to the courts and tried to change her designation from colored to white. And in 1983, the state Supreme Court said no. I mean, that even here on the right, you can see, read the judge's decision, that the judge recognized that these are social and cultural things, but they're reinforcing this idea about Blackness. We talk about this as sort of the one drop rule. I mean, 1/32. I mean, if you're really basing things on biology, would it not be 51 versus 49%? If you're in the 51 category or higher, that would be a particular race, right? I mean, that would be more logical, still be problematic, but more logical than 1/32. I mean, that just kind of tells you that sort of arbitrary nature of race. These next couple slides kind of get to, just to kind of bring into our attention a little bit of you know how during a culture in a particular time period, people can get caught up in something, right? There's night this and how that what they get caught up in starts to it can create fears, hysteria, and it's oftentimes it could be based on a lot of misinformation, and it's a reaction sometimes to things that are changing in the environment. People may feel threatened in some way. So in the 1950s, you got okay, put a little bit of context around it. 1950s, the civil rights movement. I mean, okay, March on Washington, MLK, 1963, 1950s. Things are going on. I mean, there's more recognition in terms of racial inequality. There's more movement towards racial justice in the 1950s. There's organizing going on in the 1950s. There's the mass migration out of the South to the North in the 1940s, 1950s. So greater opportunity for whites and blacks to be in the same space. There became a concern in the 1950s. I should go back real quick. So it's like this other to kind of like to bring this forward as well. If you can see this, this is a notice in the South, I think it's Louisiana, encouraging white parents not to buy Negro records because the belief was that this music would bring white people, youth, and black youth together. That this music, and you can kind of read the language in here, that this music is insightful. Music would promote promiscuity between white and black youth. And I bring this back to like this idea of passing is 1950s. These are kind of some of the concerns are going on among some within society itself. And there became a concern that somebody could be appear white, they could pass as white, not know that they have some other genetic history in terms of who they are. They could pass as white, and it could create some challenges if somebody married somebody or was in a relationship with somebody else and they had a child. That what would be the outcomes of that? That a child, a non-white child, would be born. So this idea of passing creates a little bit of fear among people in communities. I would think predominantly white, but I imagine other people might be concerned as well. So Lena Horne, Walter Francis White, these would be two examples of people who pass as white, but have, they're African American or have a history more closely connected to family members from Africa. This film, Pinky, is an interesting film. So this film, Pinky, this is a mother and a daughter. So, okay, and you would never notice that based on the kind of the film jacket here. In the film itself, the mother and daughter grow up in the South, or the daughter grows up in the South in in that sort of world where people see her as being black, know her family. She wants to get out of that system, and she also wants to go into nursing. She wants to develop a career in nursing. So she goes to the North, gets an education in nursing. When she's in the North, no one recognizes her as other than white. She falls in love, brings her boyfriend back home. Her boyfriend realizes, her mixed race background, or her actually not even mixed race background. She's from a black family that realizes her background. Before that creates some angst in their relationship. Before that, when they're in a romantic place in the movie, they kiss each other. And that film, because of that kiss on the film, on the silver screen, that film was banned in Marshall, Texas, and it went through the state Supreme Court of whether or not a city could ban the showing of the film. The belief was that the film was promoting miscegenation, promoting interracial mixing. And the interesting kind of thing about it too is that the director of the film, Elia Kazan, chose two actors who were identified as white, who were white, to play the roles, the characters, because knew it would be a problem if there was a white person and a black person sort of appearing on screen and them kissing. So it was the idea, right? It was the idea during that time period. I don't know if I want to spend too much time on this idea of passing, but this is just kind of real quick, just so you don't wonder what it is. This is a representation that came out of the Carnegie Institute, trying to alleviate white people's concerns predominantly about what would happen if you had a white person or somebody could pass as white, married a white person. The idea was that they would have a white baby. Like, don't worry, you'd have a white baby. Now, the reason I bring this this representation forward is to get at the absurdity of that and to sort of capture that's the fear that's going on in that time period. But then all the stuff that's going on here, to go back to this idea here, right? That scientists were probably doing things in an unconscious way, not necessarily a deliberate way. They're reinforcing something they believed in. And I think you could see that in this chart here as well, that this chart, the characterizations, there's a lot of racism that's going on that's embedded underneath this, the language choices in terms of how individuals are described, the characterizations, and on and on. So I don't know, it's just interesting to look at the past, to not only understand the past, but you got to be thinking that some of that stuff is still part of our culture, right? Couple different examples, like the one drop rule, to go back to that. Tiger Woods, he's one time in an interview, he said he is not a black golfer, an African-American golfer. He is Kablan Asian, Caucasian, Black, Indian, and Asian. Colin Powell is Dutch American, he's African-American would be the way he may even describe himself, or others describe him. He's also, he's Dutch American as well, as equally. And so there's why that sort of designation in terms of Blackness. Ted Cruz, he has a Latino background, and so what his history and his family background, we see him as being white. It's like, okay, it's kind of interesting, right? It's kind of like, what, what's going on? How do we think about that? This is a real kind of a brief, I don't know, just a brief summary from an article in New York Times. Basically, it says race is not biologically determined. Race is a social construct. The U.S. Census recognizes that. So that recognizes that it's a social definition, recognized in a country, not an attempt to define things biologically. And this is a major moves and major changes to the way we think about race. Sometimes it's important, and one of the problems of seeing like a racial group, Asian American, is we forget about all the diversity underneath those umbrellas or under those categories. Native American, as if every group and every tribe for Native Americans had the same experience in the past as well as the present. And it becomes problematic because in some of these categories, because they neglect to pay attention to the complexity of different groups underneath that. I think one example here is interesting, is the Asian American, the model minority myth, that Asian Americans are smarter, brighter, more skilled in terms of math, science, technology, and all those kind of like stereotypes that go along with that. You start breaking it down, and you start to look at, okay, well, it could reinforce this idea about Asian. I mean, hopefully for most people, they don't go to that biological spot, that Asians biologically are just more intelligent, more skilled in those areas. Oftentimes I hear it more in terms of thinking about Asian culture, but that gets really complicated too, because this chart here is looking at, well, it kind of depends on what group we're going to be talking about in terms of, income level, wealth development, educational level. It depends on the group. And not only does it depend on the group, part of it isn't, because part of it may be culturally related, but part of it may be, we got to incorporate social class into this as well, or the reasons for immigrating, the resources that are available to people. So it's more complicated and more objective to look at all those factors than to say it's just, the Asian American. It's like, okay, let's look at all the different groups. Let's look at the social class of those different group members. Let's look at patterns of immigration, reasons for immigrating, support systems. I mean, all those things really matter. Okay, race is a social construct, but it is real. So this is that idea of that Thomas theorem, right? Is that it matters because that's the way we've defined it. It's the way it's still defined for many. We've structured a world in terms of laws, institutions, where race is part of those institutions, and racial inequalities and privileges and advantages are in those institutions. So imagine a world, this kind of gets into maybe kind of a little premature here, but colorblind racism. If we ignored race, we pretended that race didn't matter, or we believe that we can be colorblind. The problem with that is that the world doesn't operate that way. Number one, we see color. Color is a visual cue. Race matters in terms of how institutions respond, provide different resources sometimes, or different responses to different members of different groups. If we didn't examine that, we'd never know the degree to which racial inequities are going on. Give you an example, like college admissions. If we didn't look at the race of individuals who are applying for college, those who were admitted to college. We would never know whether or not there was racial advantaging and disadvantaging going on in those institutions. Okay, think about minority groups, kind of defining minority groups. Minority groups are defined as usually there's a distinct identity. Um, this would be different if you compare it to like the dominant group. This is where it becomes some challenges in terms of thinking about race for the dominant group versus individuals who are in a minority group for people of color. Is that for the white group, whites have a racial identity. It's impossible to not have an identity built around race. The challenge is that for people of color, it's a much more distinct part of one's identity and lived experience, and they're aware of that part of their identity. For whites, it's much more invisible. Don't think of themselves as being white. Don't understand themselves as being white. And it creates this really problematic thing for some whites where the inability to recognize how they developed ideas about whiteness and ideas about race. Part of their identity development around race is their identity around whiteness as well. To go back to like characteristics of minority groups, usually there's a distinct identity. Usually race is a master status. People see them through that sort of lens of race. Institutional disadvantage, so different discrimination, different treatment, different institutions, whether that's education, healthcare, just whatever institution. Involuntary, so it's an ascribed status, and then aware of that subordination. The question here is, when does a minority become a majority group? This is looking at changing demographics. Somewhere around the year 2050, that whites will no longer be the numerical majority, but they will still be the political and sociological majority. Political and sociological majority is not about numbers, it's about political and social power. For example, in many states in the United States, right, during slavery, whites, as slaves outnumbered blacks in a lot of communities, but whites were the majority, political sociological majority. India, the British were South Africa, and looking at colonization, domination in those communities. It's about the ability to control, like that's the power, not the numbers. Different theories and applications, if we can apply them, bring them forward. Functionalism has this sort of idea that race serves as a vehicle to bring people into a group unit. Groups tend to be ethnocentric, so they develop a viewpoint based on their own group's perspective, and may sometimes have a hard time understanding the vantage point and lived experience of different groups. This becomes part of the challenge, from the critique of the functionalist perspective. So the logic would be people seek meaning and belonging and connection in social groups. Race is one way that we organize. That organization helps bring people within a group of common identity and common experience. The problem in that approach, or the limitation of that approach, is that it does not adequately address, number one, why those particular groups. We can organize ourselves in different ways. Why did we organize ourselves in terms of race being a group that we organized around? It doesn't address the issue of social, collective, political, economic power between different groups. And it sort of has the assumption that the ideals that we hold in society, the racial ideals, are a value consensus. And the reality is that there may be a consensus, for example, to recognizing diversity, to non-discrimination, non-prejudice to individuals based on their race and other characteristics of who they are. The reality is that there's a lot of inequity and a lot of power that goes deeply entrenched in American culture that's not based on a consensus, but it's been based in the past based on overt power, overt use of power of writing laws in ways that are that are legally discriminatory at that time period, to today where there's a lot of injustices that are currently going on and will continue to go on that are based on not maybe legal, like it's overt, but more covert forms of discrimination. The functionalist view, the idea would be social groups, belonging, connection. The limitation is that it doesn't address why these groups, it doesn't address the relative power of one group versus another and some other things. Conflict theory gets us into, I think, a much more complete understanding and examination of looking at inequities to move towards a more just model, a more equitable, a model based on equity and justice. This is really, I would argue, this is, the ideal American culture thing is equality of opportunity. To make sure there's equality of opportunity, and even this idea going back to social class about merit, that our outcomes should be based on merit. To get there means we have to understand how privilege happens and dismantle privilege. And that's going to be a huge challenge, because it's one thing to say, well, let's help to make sure that people that are being held down are no longer being held down by artificial means. It's another to say, let's make sure that people are being artificially elevated no longer receive those privileges to be artificially elevated. I mean, that's a whole different discussion, because people oftentimes don't want to give up their privilege, more likely to want to help individuals who are disadvantaged or groups who are disadvantaged, but not wanting to give up the privileges that they have. And again, if we go back to this chart, you got to be aware the dominant group sometimes is not aware of their own sort of sense of their own privileged position, their own ways in which race has influenced their own lived experience, and just have not engaged in that before. Okay, a couple different examples. This is that scientific racism, just another chart of that. Trayvon Martin, I think there are a lot of those in the George Zimmerman, who shot and killed Trayvon Martin. I think for a lot of people, George Floyd, all these different examples, right? There's some racial inequalities that are going on. The stand your ground laws during Trayvon Martin. I mean, these stand your ground laws. I mean, like what is going on? People raising the questions about the inequities of those laws, how it would have been different if a white person was shot by a black person. I mean, and it would have been, and the stand your ground defense would have happened. I mean, I think the status of the individual makes a difference for sure. This is a little bit longer conversation probably to get to this, but the idea is that the dominant group are the ones who, as a group, the ones that can be racist. The reverse, individuals or groups that are in subordinate positions cannot, because they lack the power to change that system. I don't want to go down that pathway too far, but it's a more complicated discussion, but that's kind of like, trying to address, basically trying to highlight that conflict theory examines that system of inequality. Conflict theory would look at, that white supremacy, for example, is not something that disappeared after Martin Luther King in 1963. It didn't disappear after any particular year. White supremacy is our nation that was founded on ideals of white supremacy, and they carry forward. We can see that in contemporary social life, and white nationalism becoming more prominent, more visible over the last X number of years. Part of conflict theory would recognize too and address that competition between racial groups, and actually politicians and leaders who foster that competition between racial groups is a way to distract from working together across groups to create challenge to the dominant group itself. So that intergroup conflict and generating that is a political strategy to deter from uniting individuals to fight against or stand up against power. And this goes way back. You go back to during Reconstruction and after the Civil War, how different groups in the South white groups in the South were pitting groups against each other in order to foster that. Poor white people against freed blacks, to pit those two groups against each other to prevent them from forming alliances with each other. There's a lot of history of that. And then a concept called scapegoating theory. Scapegoating theory is where the real problem gets ignored, the root of the problem, and a different group gets blamed for the problems. I mean, a classic example that comes up over and over again is immigration and illegal immigration. That illegal immigration, whether legal or illegal, is viewed as for some, right? It's a scapegoat. For economic problems, it's because of immigration, for crime, for poverty, for economic woes, whatever it may be. We blame the immigrant versus looking at the actual root of the problem itself, right? And this goes way back. I mean, I think this is to understand the present, I think you have to go back and understand the past. This is 1800s depiction, the Chinese They're here working labor, building railroads, building industry, that time period predominantly in the West. Here's the Black Irish. The Irish, when they immigrated to the United States, were not viewed as being white. They were, their own stigma for being Irish. And the belief was that these two groups are destroying America. They're eating Uncle Sam. Criminality, poverty, vice, drunkenness, all these different kind of things. The view that these two different groups are the ones causing all these particular problems. Well, it's an easy explanation, right? That ignores the structural realities of things. When we have big sectors of our economy that are dependent upon immigrant labor, both illegal as well as legal. We have ways of life in terms of just look at housing, for example, the cost of homes. I mean, what would it look like if we didn't have that labor to contribute to those industries in that way? And then, politicians can stoke that division in order to gain political advantage. It's not to say that we shouldn't look at immigration policy and examine it and figure out, are we doing the best things we can right now? Should we make changes in our policy? Perhaps, right? But it should be based on reason and data, not on emotion. And that's kind of where we kind of get today in some sort of way. All right, okay, just a few more things. Okay, so let's kind of move to institutional level discrimination. So we can move outside of individual. So we have individual discrimination. Discrimination is behavior, prejudice is attitude. Prejudice is ways of thinking, discrimination is action. Institutional discrimination are things that are embedded in institutions, rules, regulations, process. There are things can be in them that are discriminatory towards different groups, whether intentionally or not. This is an example. Voter disenfranchisement goes way back in American history, and it still goes on today. And here's an example: state of Louisiana, a literacy test. This is what individuals would have to go through in order to be able to pass this. And I'd say not only individuals, but Black individuals in particular. It wasn't everyone who's given this test. It was predominantly Black people given this test. Totally arbitrary stuff. Like, what is this about? You kind of go through this and you don't even know, I don't even know if I could even answer that question, or there could be 5 ways of answering that question. And that's exactly the point, is that it left it up to the person in the county who's looking at screening these applications to go, you didn't pass the test. We've had different kind of tests in the past, going back to the poll tax, the literacy test, voter ID laws. There's under a pretense, there's 2 different parts to that, right? It's this idea that making sure that people who should be voting or that have the constitutional right to vote are voting, and not individuals who don't have the right to vote, right? That's great. That's what we should be about, making sure that we have good security around our voting system. The argument would be the motivation for why groups are putting forward these voter ID laws is not about the integrity of the voting system. It's about political power. It's about gaining and maintaining political power. While there may be some cases, there are some cases of voter fraud. It is so small. It is so minuscule. There are bigger fish to fry in terms of dealing with issues in terms of voting. This is about, again, scapegoating. It's about using things in order to maintain a position within the system. And then finally, colorblind racism. This I mentioned this idea that if we move this idea of that we are colorblind, we're ignoring looking at the way that race does enter our world, right? We see race, there's institutional discrimination, there's racial discrimination that happens intentionally, unintentionally. And if we say, let's not collect information about race, let's not look and how race matters, we're going to ignore the racial inequities themselves, and who's going to be best served by that in terms of from a access to resource viewpoint. It's those individuals and groups that are already in positions of power, right? So whites are going to be more likely to be advantaged by this sort of idea of colorblind racism. I don't see color, I just see people. I don't hear that anymore. That was just 1990s. That was this common thing. I don't see people. I don't see color, I just see people. Well, it's impossible. We see visual cues. The question isn't whether a person sees color or not, it's what they think about when they see color. Like, how do they see color? How do they see color matter in a way? I put a couple of other, there's a couple of videos here if you're interested in it. There's a pretty good website looking at kind of a project done of exploring whiteness. Brian Stevenson, who I value a lot, he's got a real, comes from a place of a lot of compassion, understanding, strength. He's very incredibly, he's got a depth of knowledge and information and perspective that's very humanizing, and talking about difficult topics in ways that are not divisive and separating, but in humanizing all human groups, and with the focus on moving us forward in a way that we become stronger as a collective, as a group, as a nation. So I encourage you, I don't know, Brian Stevenson, Just Mercy is a book that he wrote. It also became a film. It's on Netflix. The book is incredibly powerful. It's basically, he's devoted his life to working with individuals on death row and looking at the racial injustices in the criminal justice system. And it's compelling. And it's a real powerful read. And then this is a really interesting talk given by Simon Tam, Give Racism a Chance, about an opportunity he had to interview a white supremacist. And it's, what really thought-provoking for me was going through and how deliberate it was that he went through the process of thinking, I'm going to interview this white supremacist. What am I going to ask this white supremacist so that I can learn, I can learn things about why individuals belong to white supremacist groups. And he went through this process of thinking what question to ask and how to ask it in a way that doesn't defile, dehumanize that particular individual that he was interviewing, right? So that he wanted to make sure the interview was one about understanding and investigation versus condemning and critiquing. And I just thought, I did an exercise one time with a group of students, taking topics and said, okay, only thing we can do is ask questions. We can't assert any viewpoint, opinion, value, belief. We just have to ask questions. And the questions cannot be loaded. The questions have to be trying to get information to be used to be able to gain information and perspective. The questions, and then, so that's just like the technical part, right? Trying to ask really good questions to help understand. And then the second part, if you're interviewing someone in a group, let's say in this case, Simon Tam interviewing someone who's a white supremacist, making sure the question is asked so that the tone of voice, body demeanor, nonverbals aren't giving cues or not communicating a sense of animosity, division, separation, but rather common humanity. I don't know, just really kind of powerful kind of talk. Encourage you to watch those. All right, that's a lot for today. As a reminder to you, just one more time. So in your summary points, content, bring in content. It's about discussing content that was discussed in the lecture, bringing it forward, providing examples, illustrations maybe, but heavy content, reflection stuff. All right, you guys are amazing. Have yourself a good rest of your day, and I'll see you in class.